The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado, California. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical vest one final time, knowing that today would either make or break her military career. At 26, she had already proven herself in countless situations, but nothing had prepared her for what lay ahead in the next few hours. The briefing room fell silent as Commander James Harrison entered, his weathered face bearing the scars of 2 decades in special operations. Behind him followed the most elite group of warriors the Navy had ever produced, 267 Navy SEALs from various teams, each one a legend in his own right. Sarah felt the weight of their collective gaze as she stood at attention, the only woman among giants. "Today marks a historic moment," Commander Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men through the darkest corners of the world. "For the first time in Navy SEAL history, we have a female candidate who has successfully completed BUD/S training and all preliminary qualifications. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell will undergo the final evaluation, a combat simulation that will determine if she becomes the first woman to earn the SEAL Trident." The room remained eerily quiet. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, watching her father return from his 3rd deployment with Delta Force. He had always told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Today, she would need every ounce of that courage. Commander Harrison continued, "This exercise will test not just physical capability, but mental fortitude, tactical thinking, and leadership under the most extreme pressure. The scenario is simple: Lieutenant Mitchell must complete a hostage rescue mission while being pursued by hostile forces. The catch is that every one of you," he gestured to the assembled SEALs, "will be playing the role of enemy combatants." A murmur rippled through the room. This wasn't standard protocol. Usually, final evaluations involved instructors and role players, not the entire SEAL community. Sarah realized this was more than just a test, it was a statement. The Navy was putting her against the best to see if she truly belonged among them. "The mission parameters are as follows," Harrison explained, pulling down a tactical map. "At 0800 hours, Lieutenant Mitchell will infiltrate a mock village 12 miles from this position. Intelligence indicates 3 hostages are being held in separate locations within the compound. She has 6 hours to locate, extract, and deliver all 3 hostages to the extraction point alive. Failure to complete the mission within the time limit results in automatic disqualification." Sarah studied the map intently. The terrain was unforgiving, dense forest leading to an urban environment with multiple buildings, alleyways, and potential ambush points. She had trained in similar environments, but never with this level of opposition. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Commander Harrison addressed her directly, "you will be equipped with standard combat gear, simulated ammunition, and a communications device for emergency use only. The opposing force," he nodded toward the SEALs, "will have orders to capture or neutralize you using any means necessary, short of causing permanent injury. Paint rounds will be used to simulate live ammunition." Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks, raised his hand. "Sir, what are the rules of engagement for the opposing force?" "Standard combat protocols apply. Lieutenant Mitchell is to be treated as any enemy combatant would be in a real-world scenario. Show no quarter, expect none in return." Harrison's words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had trained alongside some of these men during various exercises, but today they would be hunting her with the same intensity they brought to real combat operations. There would be no friendly faces, no allies, no backup. "One final note," Harrison added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This evaluation has drawn attention from the highest levels of the Pentagon. The results will determine not just Lieutenant Mitchell's future, but potentially the future of women in special operations across all branches of the military. The pressure is immense, and the stakes couldn't be higher." As the briefing concluded, the SEALs began filing out to prepare for their roles as the opposing force. Sarah noticed the looks they gave her, some respectful, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. She had expected this. Breaking barriers was never easy, and she was attempting to shatter one of the most sacred in the military. Chief Petty Officer Martinez approached her as she gathered her gear. Mitchell, he said quietly, I served with your father in Afghanistan. He was one of the finest soldiers I ever knew. But this isn't about bloodlines or legacy. Today, you're on your own. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I wouldn't want it any other way, Chief. As she made her way to the armory, Sarah's mind raced through everything that had led to this moment. Growing up on military bases around the world, she had always been different from other girls her age. While they played with dolls, she was learning hand-to-hand combat from her father. While they dreamed of becoming teachers or nurses, she dreamed of serving her country in the most elite units the military had to offer. The path hadn't been easy. The physical training had pushed her body beyond what she thought possible. The mental challenges had tested her resolve in ways she never imagined. The discrimination had been constant whispered comments about lowered standards, suggestions that she was there to fill quotas rather than earn her place, and the ever-present assumption that she would eventually quit when things got too difficult. But Sarah had persevered through it all. She had outperformed male candidates in marksmanship, underwater demolitions, and survival training. She had led teams through complex missions during training exercises, earning grudging respect from instructors who had initially doubted her capabilities. Every small victory had been hard-fought and well-earned. Now, as she checked her equipment one final time, Sarah knew that everything came down to the next 6 hours. Her sidearm was secured in its holster, spare magazines distributed across her tactical vest. Her radio was set to emergency frequencies only, using it would mean admitting defeat. The paint rounds in her weapon looked identical to live ammunition, a constant reminder that this exercise was as close to real combat as training could get. The mock village had been constructed specifically for urban warfare training. Buildings made of reinforced materials could withstand explosive charges and gunfire while providing realistic environments for close-quarters combat. Hidden cameras throughout the area would record every moment of the exercise, creating a permanent record of her performance. At precisely 0800 hours, Sarah crossed the starting line and disappeared into the dense forest surrounding the training facility. Behind her, 267 of the most skilled warriors in the world began their hunt. They had 6 hours to stop her, and they intended to use every second of it. The forest floor was soft beneath her boots as Sarah moved through the underbrush with practiced silence. Her first objective was to reach an overwatch position where she could observe the village and identify the locations of the 3 hostages. Intelligence reports were often incomplete or outdated, and she knew better than to rely solely on briefing materials. As she moved deeper into the woods, Sarah's senses were heightened to an almost supernatural degree. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, every bird call was analyzed and categorized as either natural or potentially threatening. The opposing force would be setting up their defensive positions now, placing snipers, establishing patrol routes, and creating kill zones designed to funnel her into carefully prepared ambushes. After 45 minutes of careful movement, Sarah reached a ridge overlooking the village. Through her binoculars, she could see the compound clearly, a collection of single and multi-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard. 3 structures had been marked with red tape, indicating the likely locations of the hostages. But she also noticed something that wasn't in the briefing materials: additional buildings that could provide concealment for the opposing force. As she studied the layout, Sarah began formulating her plan. The direct approach would be suicide. The SEALs would expect her to attempt a frontal assault and would be prepared accordingly. Instead, she would need to use deception, misdirection, and the element of surprise to accomplish her mission. A slight movement in her peripheral vision caused her to freeze. 200 meters to her left, a ghillie-suited figure was moving through the trees with the fluid grace of an apex predator. Sarah recognized the movement pattern immediately: Master Chief Rodriguez, one of the most experienced snipers in the SEAL community. He was positioning himself to cover the most likely approaches to the village. Sarah carefully withdrew from her observation point, making sure to leave no trace of her presence. The hunt had officially begun, and she was the prey. But, as she melted back into the forest, a grim smile crossed her face. They might be hunting her, but she had learned from the best. Her father hadn't just taught her how to fight, he had taught her how to think like a warrior. The next few hours would test every skill she had ever learned, every lesson she had absorbed, and every ounce of determination she possessed. Somewhere in that village, 3 simulated hostages waited for rescue. Between her and them stood 267 of the most dangerous men in the world, each one committed to proving that she didn't belong among their ranks. Sarah Mitchell had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Now it was time to show the world what she was truly made of. 2 hours into the mission, Sarah had successfully navigated around 3 separate patrol teams and identified the exact locations of all 3 hostages. The SEALs were good, better than good, but they were also predictable in their excellence. They had set up textbook defensive positions, which meant Sarah could anticipate their movements based on her own training in the same tactics. The first hostage was located in a single-story building on the eastern edge of the compound. Through careful observation, Sarah had determined that only 2 guards were posted inside, with a sniper team providing overwatch from a building 50 meters away. This would be her starting point, the easiest extraction that would allow her to gain momentum for the more challenging rescues ahead. Sarah approached the building from the blind spot she had identified during her reconnaissance. The structure had been built to simulate a typical Middle Eastern dwelling, with thick walls and small windows that limited visibility. She had noticed that the guards inside followed a routine patrol pattern, checking different rooms every 12 minutes like clockwork. Timing would be everything. At exactly 1030 hours, Sarah moved. She had fashioned improvised climbing gear from her equipment, allowing her to scale the rear wall of the building during the guard's patrol cycle. The roof access was minimal, but her small frame allowed her to squeeze through a ventilation opening that would have been impossible for most of the SEALs pursuing her. Inside the building, she could hear the muffled voices of the 2 guards discussing the exercise. "She'll never make it past Rodriguez's sniper team," one was saying. "Chief's got every approach covered." Sarah smiled grimly as she lowered herself silently into the room where the first hostage, a role-playing instructor wearing civilian clothes, sat bound to a chair. The man's eyes widened in surprise as she appeared seemingly from nowhere. "Stay quiet," she whispered, cutting his restraints with a tactical knife. "We're leaving through the window." The extraction took less than 90 seconds. Sarah had studied the guard patrol patterns so carefully that she was able to move the hostage out of the building and to a concealment position in the forest before the guards even realized he was missing. When they discovered the empty chair, their radio chatter immediately alerted the entire opposing force that the impossible was happening. Sarah Mitchell was succeeding. "This is Building 1, came the frustrated voice over the radio frequency Sarah was monitoring. "Package 1 is gone. Repeat, Package 1 is compromised. She's better than we thought." The second hostage presented a much greater challenge. Located on the second floor of the central building, the position was covered by multiple sniper teams and had at least 8 guards providing security. Sarah knew that a conventional approach would be suicide, so she decided to create a diversion that would draw the attention of the opposing force away from her real target. Using materials from her pack, Sarah constructed a small explosive device, not enough to cause injury, but sufficient to create noise and confusion. She placed it on the western side of the compound, set the timer for 15 minutes, and began moving toward her real objective from the opposite direction. When the device detonated, the effect was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. The SEALs immediately converged on the explosion site, assuming it was either a diversion or the beginning of her assault on that position. In the chaos that followed, Sarah was able to approach the central building with significantly reduced opposition. The second-floor window was her entry point, accessed by a dangerous climb up the exterior wall while the remaining guards were focused on the distraction she had created. The physical demands were enormous, her arms burned from the strain of supporting her body weight while maintaining absolute silence. One slip, one carelessly placed boot, and the entire opposing force would know her location. Inside the building, Sarah found herself face-to-face with 2 guards who were monitoring the radio chatter from the explosion. They were so focused on coordinating with their teammates that they never noticed her presence until it was too late. Using non-lethal takedown techniques, she neutralized both guards and secured the second hostage within minutes. 2 down, 1 to go, she whispered to herself as she led the second hostage to safety through a route she had pre-planned during her initial reconnaissance. But the opposing force was adapting to her tactics. Commander Harrison's voice came over the radio with new orders: "All teams, this is command. Mitchell is using classic asymmetric warfare tactics.
Tighten the perimeter around Building 3. No one gets in or out without being seen.
The third hostage was located in the most heavily defended position, a 3-story building in the center of the compound that had been turned into a fortress.
Sarah counted at least 12 guards visible from her observation point, with likely more inside that she couldn't see.
Sniper teams covered every approach, and the building itself had been modified to eliminate blind spots and hiding places. This was where the real test would come. As Sarah studied the building, she realized that conventional military tactics would never work. The SEALs had anticipated every standard approach and had prepared accordingly. She needed to think beyond her training, beyond doctrine, beyond everything she had learned in military schools and exercises. The answer came to her as she watched the guards' rotation patterns. They were following procedures designed to repel external threats, but they weren't expecting someone to voluntarily walk into their trap. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed like madness to any military strategist. Instead of trying to infiltrate the building covertly, she decided to surrender herself to the opposing force. At 1,400 hours, with just 2 hours remaining in the exercise, Sarah Mitchell walked openly across the compound's central courtyard with her hands raised above her head. Every weapon in the area was immediately trained on her as shots rang out from multiple positions. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire," came the command from Master Chief Rodriguez.
"She's surrendering." The SEALs emerged from their positions, weapons trained on Sarah as she continued walking steadily toward the central building. Their faces showed a mixture of disappointment and confusion. Had the pressure finally broken her? Had she decided that the cost of proving herself was too high? "I want to speak with whoever's in charge of Building 3, Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Chief Petty Officer Williams emerged from the building, his expression showing both relief and sadness. He had hoped she would succeed, if only to prove that the impossible could be achieved through determination and skill. "You're surrendering?" Williams asked, his weapon still trained on her center mass. "I'm requesting to negotiate the release of the hostage," Sarah replied calmly. Williams looked confused. "This is a combat exercise, Mitchell. There are no negotiations. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war have the right to communicate with their captors regarding the treatment of civilians under their control," Sarah responded, citing military law with precision. The SEALs exchanged glances. Technically, she was correct, but this was supposed to be a combat simulation, not a lesson in international law. However, the rules of the exercise hadn't explicitly forbidden such an approach. "What are you proposing?" Williams asked, genuinely curious about what she had in mind. "Single combat," Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the now silent compound. "You choose your best fighter. If I win, the hostage goes free. If I lose, I forfeit the exercise and accept disqualification." A murmur ran through the assembled SEALs. This was completely unprecedented. Combat exercises were about tactics, strategy, and teamwork, not individual gladiatorial contests. But there was something in Sarah's stance, something in her voice, that commanded respect even from these elite warriors. Williams spoke into his radio, consulting with command. After several minutes, Commander Harrison's voice came back over the loudspeaker system. "Lieutenant Mitchell, this is highly irregular. The exercise parameters don't include provisions for single combat." "Sir," Sarah responded, "the exercise parameters also don't explicitly forbid creative problem solving. I've successfully completed 2/3 of my mission using unconventional tactics. I'm proposing to complete the final third using the same approach." There was a long pause. Sarah could imagine the discussion taking place in the command center. This was exactly the kind of thinking that special operations required, the ability to adapt, improvise, and find solutions that others couldn't see. Finally, Harrison's voice returned. "Very well, Lieutenant Mitchell. Chief Williams will select an opponent for unarmed combat. Standard rules apply. First to achieve submission or unconsciousness wins. Medical personnel are standing by." Williams surveyed his team, then made his selection. "Rodriguez, you're up."
Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, removing his tactical vest and weapons. At 6 feet 4 inches and 240 pounds of solid muscle, he was an intimidating opponent for anyone, let alone a woman who was 8 inches shorter and nearly 100 pounds lighter. But Sarah had requested this, and she would face the consequences of her decision. The two combatants faced each other in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by 267 Navy SEALs who had stopped their pursuit to witness this unprecedented moment. The silence was absolute, even the winds seemed to have stopped blowing. "Nothing personal, Mitchell," Rodriguez said quietly. "But I won't go easy on you just because you're a woman." Sarah nodded respectfully. "I wouldn't want you to, Master Chief. I've asked for this to be treated like any other combat situation." What happened next would be remembered by every SEAL present for the rest of their careers. As Rodriguez moved in for what should have been a quick and decisive victory, Sarah demonstrated why she had earned her place in this exercise through merit rather than politics. The fight that followed was not the mismatch that everyone expected. It was a masterclass in how skill, intelligence, and determination could overcome raw physical advantages when applied with precision and courage. The fight began with Rodriguez using his size advantage to close distance quickly, expecting to end the contest with a simple takedown and submission hold. But Sarah had studied his fighting style during previous training exercises, and she knew exactly what to expect. As the Master Chief lunged forward, she sidestepped with dancer-like grace, using his own momentum against him. Rodriguez stumbled slightly, surprised by her speed and timing. He had fought hundreds of opponents over his career, but few had managed to avoid his initial attack so cleanly. He turned to face her again, this time with increased respect and caution. "Not bad," he acknowledged, circling her slowly. "But now I know what you're capable of." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her eyes tracked his every movement. She had learned long ago that in combat, talking was often just another form of misdirection. Rodriguez was probing for weaknesses, testing her reactions, looking for any sign of fear or uncertainty that he could exploit. The Master Chief feinted left, then drove forward with his right shoulder, attempting to tackle Sarah to the ground where his weight advantage would be decisive. But, again, she wasn't where he expected her to be. Sarah had dropped low and rolled to the side, coming up behind Rodriguez and wrapping her arm around his neck in a chokehold attempt. Rodriguez was too experienced to be caught so easily. He grabbed Sarah's arm and used his superior upper body strength to throw her over his shoulder, sending her tumbling across the hard-packed earth of the courtyard. The assembled SEALs winced at the impact, but Sarah rolled with the throw and came up on her feet, seemingly uninjured. "She knows how to take a hit," one of the watching SEALs commented quietly. "Most people would be down after a throw like that." The fight continued for several minutes, with neither combatant able to gain a decisive advantage. Rodriguez's power and reach were formidable, but Sarah's speed and technical skill kept her in the contest. She landed several strikes to his ribs and legs, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points with surgical precision. Meanwhile, Rodriguez managed to connect with a few powerful blows that would have dropped most opponents, but Sarah absorbed the damage and kept fighting. As the minutes passed, something unexpected began to happen. Rodriguez, despite his superior conditioning, was starting to show signs of fatigue. Sarah had been fighting a war of attrition, forcing him to expend energy on powerful attacks that missed their targets, while she conserved her strength for precise counterstrikes. The turning point came when Rodriguez attempted another takedown, this time committing fully to the attack. Sarah had been waiting for exactly this moment, when his momentum would carry him past the point of no return. As he lunged forward, she dropped to the ground, planted her feet against his chest, and used his own force to catapult him over her head. Rodriguez hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Before he could recover, Sarah had moved into position and applied a rear naked choke, one of the most effective submission holds in combat sports. Her arm was positioned perfectly across his windpipe, cutting off both blood flow to his brain and his ability to breathe. "Tap out, Master Chief," Sarah whispered urgently. "Don't make me put you to sleep." Rodriguez struggled for several more seconds, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. He was one of the most respected warriors in the SEAL community, and the idea of submitting to anyone, let alone a woman who was supposed to be proving herself to him, was almost unbearable. But Rodriguez was also a professional who understood the difference between training and ego. As his vision began to narrow and darkness crept in at the edges, he tapped Sarah's arm 3 times, the universal signal of submission in combat sports. Sarah immediately released the hold, helping Rodriguez to his feet as he gasped for air. The courtyard was completely silent except for the sound of both fighters breathing heavily from their exertion.
"Good fight," Rodriguez managed to say between breaths. "You earned that one."
The SEALs watching from around the courtyard began to murmur among themselves. What they had just witnessed challenged everything they thought they knew about physical limitations and gender differences in combat. Sarah Mitchell hadn't just fought Master Chief Rodriguez, she had defeated him through superior technique and tactical thinking. Chief Williams, true to his word, nodded toward the building where the 3rd hostage was being held. "A deal's a deal," he said simply. "The hostage is yours." But, as Sarah moved toward the building, a voice cut across the courtyard like a whip crack. "Hold position." The command came from Lieutenant Commander Stevens, an officer known for his old-school attitudes and resistance to change within the SEAL community. He had been vocal in his opposition to allowing women into combat roles, and he clearly wasn't ready to accept what he had just witnessed.
"This exercise isn't over," Stevens declared, stepping into the center of the courtyard.
"Mitchell, you may have won your little contest, but you still have to extract the hostage and reach the designated extraction point. And you still have 260 SEALs between you and mission completion." Sarah looked around the courtyard, taking stock of her situation. Stevens was technically correct. Winning the fight with Rodriguez had only secured the release of the hostage, not the completion of her mission. She still had to get the rescued civilians out of the compound and to safety, all while being pursued by the most elite soldiers in the world. Furthermore, Stevens continued, his voice carrying clearly across the area, "Your little negotiation stunt has cost valuable time. You now have exactly 47 minutes to complete the extraction and reach the pickup point. Failure to meet this deadline results in automatic mission failure." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach.
47 minutes wasn't enough time to move 3 civilians through hostile territory to an extraction point that was still 8 miles away.
It was physically impossible, even under ideal conditions. Stevens smiled coldly, believing he had finally found a way to ensure Sarah's failure. Additionally, all personnel are now authorized to use any means necessary to prevent the completion of your mission. The rules of engagement have changed, Mitchell.
This is no longer an exercise, it's a full combat simulation.
The implications were clear. The SEALs would no longer be constrained by the relatively gentle parameters that had governed the exercise up to this point. They would pursue her with the same intensity and ruthlessness they brought to real-world operations. But, instead of the fear or despair Stevens expected to see on Sarah's face, he saw something that made him take an involuntary step backward. Sarah Mitchell was smiling, and there was something in her expression that every warrior in the courtyard recognized, the look of someone who had just been given exactly the challenge they were hoping for. "Understood, sir," Sarah replied calmly.
47 minutes for full extraction. Rules of engagement are now unrestricted combat simulation. Is there anything else I should know? Stevens frowned, unsettled by her reaction.
"That's all, Mitchell.
Clock starts now."
Sarah turned to the 3 rescued hostages, who had been brought to the center of the courtyard during her fight with Rodriguez. They looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern, understanding that their simulated lives now depended on her ability to accomplish the impossible. "Listen carefully," Sarah told them, her voice carrying the authority of a seasoned combat leader.
"We're about to leave this compound and move through 8 miles of hostile territory.
You will do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you to do it, without question or hesitation.
Your lives depend on following my instructions precisely. Do you understand?" All 3 nodded, impressed by the transformation they had witnessed.
The woman who had been fighting for her life minutes earlier had become a commanding officer with the presence and confidence to lead men into battle. Sarah looked around the courtyard one last time, meeting the eyes of several SEALs who would soon be hunting her.
Some looked skeptical, others appeared genuinely impressed by what she had accomplished so far. A few seemed almost eager to see what she would do next. "Master Chief Rodriguez," Sarah called out to the man she had just defeated in combat.
"Yes, ma'am?" Rodriguez responded, the honorific coming naturally despite the informal setting. "Thank you for the fight. It was an honor." Rodriguez nodded respectfully. "The honor was mine, Lieutenant. Give 'em hell out there." With that, Sarah Mitchell turned and led her 3 charges toward the edge of the compound, beginning what would either be the greatest tactical achievement in SEAL training history or a spectacular failure that would end her military career forever. As they disappeared into the tree line, Commander Harrison's voice came over the radio system one final time. "All teams, this is command. Mitchell has left the compound with all 3 packages. She has 44 minutes to reach Extraction Point Alpha. Your orders are to prevent mission completion by any means necessary within training parameters. This is not a drill, engage with full tactical response." The hunt for Sarah Mitchell had entered its final and most dangerous phase. Behind her, 267 Navy SEALs were mobilizing with the efficiency and deadly purpose that had made them legends. Ahead of her lay 8 miles of treacherous terrain, multiple ambush points, and an extraction deadline that seemed mathematically impossible to meet. But Sarah Mitchell had already done the impossible twice in the past 5 hours. As she led her charges into the wilderness, she was determined to prove that sometimes the most unlikely victories come from refusing to accept that failure is inevitable. The next 44 minutes would determine not just her own future, but potentially the future of every woman who dreamed of serving her country in the most elite units the military had to offer. Sarah Mitchell had come too far to quit now, and she had no intention of letting down the countless women who would follow in her footsteps if she succeeded. The final test was about to begin, and she was ready for whatever came next. The forest erupted into controlled chaos as 267 Navy SEALs deployed with military precision to intercept Sarah and her charges. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as team leaders coordinated blocking positions, sniper teams moved to high ground, and quick reaction forces prepared to converge on any confirmed sightings. This was the full might of America's most elite warriors brought to bear on a single target. Sarah moved through the terrain with her 3 rescued hostages like a ghost, using every piece of cover and concealment the landscape offered. She had plotted multiple routes to the extraction point during her initial reconnaissance, knowing that adaptability would be crucial once the opposition understood her capabilities. The direct route would have required 38 minutes of hard movement under ideal conditions, impossible with 3 civilians and active pursuit. Instead, Sarah led her group along a circuitous path that took advantage of a creek bed running roughly parallel to their destination. The water would mask their thermal signatures and muffle the sound of their movement, while the vegetation along the banks provided visual concealment. It would add distance to their journey, but it might also add precious minutes of undetected movement. "How much farther?" whispered one of the hostages, a young instructor who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what Sarah was attempting. 6 miles, Sarah replied quietly, checking her compass and tactical watch. 39 minutes. Stay close and move exactly where I move." Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Sarah could hear helicopter rotors in the distance. The exercise commanders had authorized air support to make the challenge even more realistic. Thermal imaging and aerial observation would make concealment exponentially more difficult. As they moved through the creek bed, Sarah's mind raced through tactical calculations. The SEALs would establish a perimeter around the extraction point and work inward, forcing her into an ever-shrinking box. They would use their superior numbers to set up interlocking fields of fire, making any approach to the landing zone a potential death trap. Traditional infantry tactics would never work against such overwhelming opposition. But Sarah Mitchell had never been traditional. 22 minutes into the final phase of her mission, Sarah made a decision that would have been considered madness by any military manual. Instead of continuing toward the extraction point, she turned 90 degrees and headed directly toward the largest concentration of opposing forces. "Where are we going?" asked one of the hostages, confusion evident in his voice. "Into the belly of the beast," Sarah replied grimly. She had remembered something from the morning briefing, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time but now represented her only chance for success. Commander Harrison had mentioned that emergency protocols were in place, with medical personnel and evacuation helicopters on standby throughout the exercise area. Those medical evacuation assets would be positioned at predetermined locations, ready to respond to any serious injuries that might occur during the training. Sarah's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to reach the designated extraction point while being hunted by hundreds of elite warriors, she would create a medical emergency that would bring the evacuation assets to her. The risks were enormous. Simulating a serious injury convincingly enough to trigger medical evacuation protocols would require actual physical trauma. But Sarah had calculated that it was her only realistic chance of completing the mission within the impossible time constraints she faced. As they approached the area where she knew the largest concentration of SEALs would be positioned, Sarah gathered her 3 charges around her. "Listen carefully," she whispered urgently. "In about 5 minutes, I'm going to do something that will look extremely dangerous. When I give the signal, all 3 of you need to start calling for medical assistance as loudly as possible. Use the emergency radio frequencies and make it clear that there's been a serious accident." The hostages looked at her with growing alarm. "What kind of accident?" one of them asked. Sarah checked her watch. 18 minutes remaining. "The kind that gets medical helicopters scrambling for an emergency evacuation." Before they could protest, Sarah was moving again, leading them toward a rocky outcropping that overlooked a valley where she could see the muzzle flashes of simulated gunfire. The SEALs were conducting a systematic sweep of the area, moving in coordinated teams that left no hiding place unchecked. At the base of the outcropping was exactly what Sarah was looking for: a steep slope covered in loose rocks and debris. It was the kind of terrain that claimed dozens of casualties every year in military training exercises, where a single misstep could result in serious injury or death. When I reached the bottom, Sarah instructed her charges, "Give me exactly 60 seconds, then start broadcasting distress calls. Report that I fell approximately 40 feet and am unconscious with possible spinal injuries. Medical evacuation is required immediately." "This is insane," one of the hostages protested. "You could actually be killed." Sarah met his eyes with steady determination. "Better to risk death attempting something extraordinary than to accept certain failure," she replied. "This is our only chance." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah Mitchell stepped to the edge of the slope and deliberately threw herself down the rocky incline. What followed was a terrifying controlled fall that required every ounce of skill and courage Sarah possessed. She used techniques learned in paratrooper training to absorb impact, rolling and sliding rather than trying to resist the momentum. Rocks and debris cascaded around her as she tumbled down the 40-foot slope, each impact calculated to appear accidental while minimizing actual damage to her body. When she reached the bottom, Sarah lay perfectly still in a position that suggested serious injury. Blood from multiple cuts and scrapes covered her face and arms, creating a convincing picture of trauma that would be visible to any medical personnel who responded. Above her, right on schedule, came the urgent calls for assistance. "Emergency! Emergency! We have a service member down with critical injuries. Request immediate medical evacuation." The effect was immediate and dramatic. All pursuit activities stopped as the emergency response protocols took over. Medical helicopters that had been standing by throughout the exercise were scrambled to Sarah's location, their crews believing they were responding to an actual accident rather than an elaborate deception. Sarah remained motionless as she heard the approaching rotor noise, fighting against every instinct that told her to move, to run, to continue the mission through conventional means. This was perhaps the greatest test of discipline she had ever faced, deliberately appearing helpless when every fiber of her being screamed at her to keep fighting. The medical evacuation helicopter set down in the only suitable landing area, a small clearing that was less than 50 meters from the designated extraction point for her original mission. As medical personnel rushed to assess her condition, Sarah waited for exactly the right moment. "Patient appears unconscious with possible head trauma," the lead medic called out as he knelt beside her. "Let's get her loaded and, now!" Sarah shouted, her eyes snapping open as she rolled to her feet with startling speed. The 3 hostages, who had been hiding in the rocks above, immediately slid down the slope and ran toward the helicopter. The medical crew, still processing what was happening, found themselves face to face with a woman who was supposed to be critically injured but was instead very much alert and in command of the situation. "I need to commandeer this aircraft for an emergency extraction," Sarah announced with complete authority. "These 3 individuals require immediate evacuation from a hostile area."
The helicopter crew was completely bewildered.
They had responded to what they believed was a legitimate medical emergency, only to find themselves in the middle of a training exercise that had somehow gone completely off the rails. "Ma'am, we're not part of the exercise," the pilot protested. "We're actual medical evacuation, then. You understand the importance of extracting injured personnel from a dangerous area," Sarah replied smoothly, gesturing to the 3 hostages who were already climbing into the helicopter. "These individuals have been exposed to simulated combat for over 5 hours.
They need immediate removal from the training area."
The pilot looked to his crew chief, who could only shrug in confusion. Technically, Sarah was correct. The 3 role-playing hostages had been part of a combat exercise and could reasonably be considered to require evacuation.
The medical evacuation protocols didn't distinguish between real casualties and training participants who needed emergency removal.
"Clock!" Sarah called out, checking her tactical watch.
15 seconds.
As the helicopter lifted off with all 3 hostages safely aboard, Sarah stood in the landing zone and keyed her emergency radio.
"Command, this is Lieutenant Mitchell. Mission complete. All 3 packages successfully extracted to designated safe area. Time remaining on mission clock, 8 seconds.
The radio silence that followed was profound. In the command center, dozens of senior officers stared at monitors showing Sarah standing calmly in the extraction zone while the helicopter carrying her 3 charges disappeared toward the medical facility. She had accomplished what everyone had believed was impossible, using tactics that no one had anticipated and demonstrating a level of creative thinking that redefined what it meant to be a special operations warrior. Finally, Commander Harrison's voice came over the radio. "Lieutenant Mitchell, report to the command center immediately for debrief." As Sarah walked toward the waiting vehicles that would transport her back to the facility, she passed dozens of Navy SEALs who had spent the last 6 hours hunting her.
Their expressions ranged from stunned disbelief to grudging admiration.
She had beaten them at their own game, not through superior firepower or numbers, but through superior thinking and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Master Chief Rodriguez approached her as she reached the vehicles. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "that was the most audacious thing I've ever seen in 23 years of special operations."
Sarah nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Master Chief."
"But I had good teachers."
"No," Rodriguez replied, shaking his head. "What you did out there, that wasn't something that can be taught. That came from somewhere else entirely."
The ride back to the command center was silent, giving Sarah time to process what she had just accomplished. In 6 hours, she had successfully completed a mission that had been designed to be impossible, defeated one of the most respected warriors in the SEAL community in single combat, and demonstrated tactical thinking that challenged every assumption about women in special operations. But, more importantly, she had proven something to herself. Every doubt, every whispered comment about lowered standards, every suggestion that she was there to fill quotas rather than earn her place, all of it had been answered with actions rather than words. When she entered the command center, 267 Navy SEALs were waiting for her. The room was completely silent as she walked to the front and stood at attention before Commander Harrison.
"Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell," Harrison announced formally, "you have successfully completed the most challenging evaluation in Navy SEAL history. Your performance today was extraordinary by any measure."
He paused, looking around the room at the assembled warriors who had witnessed history being made.
"Kneel," Harrison commanded.
Sarah dropped to one knee, her head bowed as Commander Harrison drew the ceremonial sword that was used for special occasions. The silence in the room was absolute, even the sound of breathing seemed muted as everyone understood the significance of what was happening. "By the authority vested in me by the United States Navy," Harrison declared, "I hereby award you the Navy SEAL Trident, making you the first woman in history to earn the right to be called a Navy SEAL." As Sarah felt the weight of the trident being pinned to her uniform, she realized that everything she had endured, every challenge she had faced, every moment of doubt she had overcome, had led to this single moment. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the woman trying to prove she belonged among warriors. She was Petty Officer Mitchell, Navy SEAL, a designation earned through merit, courage, and an absolute refusal to quit. When she stood and faced the assembled SEALs, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 267 of the most elite warriors in the world rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. These men who had spent the day hunting her, who had initially doubted her capabilities, who had been prepared to see her fail, were now honoring her achievement with the respect that only warriors can give to those who have proven themselves in battle. Sarah Mitchell had done more than break a barrier, she had redefined what was possible when courage and determination met seemingly impossible odds. Her response to their challenge had indeed stunned the 267 Navy SEALs watching, but perhaps not in the way they had originally expected. She had shown them that the heart of a warrior knows no gender, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from those who refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable.